The Gloriana set by ThebeMoon. Read by Ella Max Mabella. Chapter 49. Let's do lunch. It had become a distressingly familiar dream for her, ever since he first leaned close in the library, whispering, "I'll kiss you if you tell me, Granger." The alluring scent of warm sunshine and cologne, the fresh, light smell of his hair. As their interactions continued, the dream added that silky feel of sad hair and the smoothness of warm skin interposed with rough stubble along his sharp jaw. Soon the dream added the feel of his hand on her waist, his lips on her throat. Now the dream was back, more vivid than ever, and she could feel softness brushing her cheeks and lips, and it was so real she actually opened her eyes and turned her head. And he was there, really, truly there, beside her in the semi-darkness lit only by glowing blue runes on the walls. She lay on her back on the soft carpet, and he on his side, looking down at her, and his eyes shone blue like a cat's. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she raised a hand to stroke his cheek and confirm he was really there. It was his lips on hers that finally convinced her this was no dream. She had found him. Draco couldn't hide from her after all, and they were in the room of requirement. This was the first time she had woken up with anyone, unless you counted the month in the tent during the war, which Hermione certainly did not. Her fingers ran down his back, his hands ran up her thighs. They both felt a little frisky, open to a little exploring, and it was a long time before either of them had anything to say. Finally, Draco pulled himself away, sitting up with his back against the wall. "We should go to Diagon Alley today," he said casually, as if they were chatting outside ancient ruins. "Nocturne Alley too," she said hopefully, scooting over to him. He sighed and put an arm around her. "If we must." Hermione's face lit up. "We can meet Vizier there. By all means, let us meet the vampire on our day out together. And we can test the blood potion in the morning before we go. It should be finished today." Hermione inched away to face him, excited by the prospect. "Just think of it, Draco. After we figure out the Mudblood's letters." Draco rolled his eyes. "We can consider our next project. Perhaps a screaming—" Draco rubbed a hand over his chin. Yes, we will certainly discuss experimental potions ad nauseam, but not right now." He yawned. "Not before my tea and morning pastries." He looked around expectantly. "Not before my tea," he repeated significantly, then sighed. "Of course, the room—" "It's nearly 8 o'clock, Hermione said, who had located her watch and was scrabbling about for her halter. Draco gave another regretful sigh and gracefully rose to his feet, pulling on his trousers. With the help of a full-length mirror the room provided, and some smoothing and tailoring spells, Hermione thought they both looked quite respectable in a short amount of time. "If we hurry, we can still make breakfast," she said. "You must be joking," Draco said. "I could never appear in the Great Hall in this condition." "You look fine," Hermione said. Draco sniffed. "Malfoys do not look fine. The rumpled I slept on the bloody floor look may pass muster at the Gryffindor table, but some houses have standards." He fussed for a moment with his left shirt cuff, glared at it, then gave it up as a bad job. "I will see you at the potions lab." "You are definitely not a morning person," Hermione observed, amused. 11 o'clock. Draco stepped up to her, and his warm kiss belied his snooty tone. "Don't be late this time." He ran his knuckles along her cheek and left the room, obviously anxious to get to the dungeon before anyone saw him in such a state. Hermione just shook her head, taking a minute to admire the runes on the walls a bit longer before leaving herself. Draco might need the next 3 hours to primp, but she was going to breakfast. She was starving, and if Gryffindor's Saturday morning standards were a bit lax, Ron had turned up in his bathrobe one morning and no one even noticed. Well, she could only be grateful. After breakfast, she returned to her room, showering and dithering about her clothes for London. Ginny hadn't been at breakfast and wasn't around to consult. Her favourite jeans and jumper were rejected, as was anything red and gold. She thought about transfiguring a blouse green, but transfigured colours were a tricky business and often caused streaking. Finally, she chose a dark purple blouse with a shortened black skirt and knee-high boots, then tousled with her hair until she remembered Gloriana said. Surely it was all right to wear it now. She thought of Narcissa and Lucius and almost quailed, then shook her head. They weren't the Malfoys that mattered. So she used a large clip to pull her hair off her face along the curls that tumbled down her back. There! She arrived at the potions lab 20 minutes early. The blood magic potion looked perfect, definitely ready with puffs of pink steam swirling clockwise up from the cauldron. She could test her blood now, but wanted to wait for Draco, so she began reviewing her list of other experimental potions. There was a curative potion for cursed scars she literally itched to try. Hermione? Draco stood in the doorway, apparently groomed to his satisfaction. He wore black trousers and a green cashmere jumper so dark it was almost black. Good morning, she said, feeling awkward, as she always did when they had polite exchanges like normal people. He stepped forward with a smug smile, and Hermione leaned into him, feeling his fingers brush the diamond clip in her hair. Is it ready? He asked, looking over her head at the cauldron. Yes. She turned away and fastened black ropes over her clothes. Draco slid his arm into his ropes and hooked them both together while Hermione got out the vials. Using the tongs, Draco carefully dipped the vial into the potion and set it into a wooden holder. Then he produced a small silver knife and handed it to her. D.L.M. was engraved on the sheath. These Malfoys and their monograms. What's this? She asked. 7th birthday present, he said. Of course, what small boy doesn't need his own engraved silver knife? It's not cursed, is it? She asked. Draco scowled. Too soon? Yes, was all he said. Hermione pulled the knife from its sheath and ran its edges along her finger. The silver blade was wicked sharp. Beads of red instantly appeared, and she had the finger over the vial. A few drops of blood fell into the potion. Draco handed her a handkerchief, and they both watched the vial anxiously. 1, 2, 3 seconds, and the potion in the vial turned clear. We did it! Hermione cried. We did it! She beamed up at him. Yes, he said. He ran his wand over her finger, healing it instantly. Now your turn, she said excitedly. She dipped another vial into the potion with the tongs and placed it in the holder. Draco cut his palm with the knife and dripped blood into the vial. There was no reaction at first. Hermione had begun counting as soon as his blood hit the potion. When she got to 30 seconds, she and Draco exchanged confused looks, then looked down at the vial again and gasped. The small sample of potion was swirling, changing color. The potion was now pale purple. Draco flinched back from the vial, crushing into the shelf behind him. Not even the sound of glass battles striking to the stone floor could pull Hermione's eyes from the vial, its damning purple color shining clearly. It can't be. There must be some mistake. She wondered to hear her voice so calm and confident. Let's try it again. She looked at Draco now, and his eyes were wide and confused. All right, he said hoarsely. Hermione set up another vial, and Draco viciously sliced at his palm, crossing the previous wound, marking an X. He thrust a hand over the vial, and the stream of blood, he'd cut the skin rather deeply, poured into the vial. Then he dropped his hand, not even bothering to bind it, as Hermione counted the seconds. 36 seconds, and the vial turned pale purple again. Fuck! Draco shouted, fisting his bloodied hand and slamming it on the table. The vials and cauldron shook, and Hermione held her breath, but nothing spilled. Give me your hand, she said. He ignored her, panting. She moved closer and put her hand on his fist. The knuckles were now bleeding as well. Draco. He slowly opened his fist, blood running between his fingers. She cast a quick healing spell, then Tergeo, and he put the hand on the table. She could see it was trembling, and put her own hand over it. Look at me, Draco, she said. He did, his grey eyes full of pain. There is an explanation, and it's not that you wrote the message. What other explanation could there be? He asked. Was I possessed? Imperious? Did someone get hold of my blood somehow? There were some Death Eater rituals. Maybe the potion is flawed, Hermione said. It is experimental. There could be factors. He laughed bitterly. The potion is perfect, and you know it. How could it not be? You created it. I'm not perfect, she said. Just practically perfect. He didn't smile, just looked down, his white blonde fringe hiding his eyes. She didn't like that and reached up to brush it away, but he flinched from her touch. Are you going to tell Potter? He asked. The question is, are we going to tell Potter? She said. We decide together. He raised his head and looked at her. What do you think? Hermione took a moment to consider, and he watched with that endearing patience he often displayed while she was thinking. She tilted her head and squinted at the cauldron, the lazy pink steam still rising. We need time, she said finally. It's a complicated potion. Something could be affecting its performance. We're also meeting Vizir today, and he might have an insight. She looked at Draco again. But yes, we will have to tell Harry at some point. He knows about the potion. He knows we're testing it. I was going to send it out to him today, but I can delay a day or two. Hermione. His voice was hoarse. With that information, Kingsley could drag me in for questioning, or— Nobody's dragging you anywhere, Draco, she said briskly. The good news is that Harry never told Kingsley about the potion. Officially, he knows nothing. He sneered. St. Potter is not going to withhold vital information in an Auror investigation, and once he finds out about this, he'll run straight to Kingsley. No, he won't, Hermione said stubbornly. This is my potion. I conceived it, we brewed it, and I have some say over how information it yields is used. If Harry did such a thing, and I don't for a minute believe he would, I would testify to the unreliability of this blood potion and its inadmissibility as evidence, and that would be the truth. I wouldn't turn in anybody on the strength of this potion alone. Draco sat heavily on the stool, his head in his hands. I wish I understood what's happening. So do I. Hermione stood in front of him and slid her hands over the back of his neck. He put his arms around her waist, leaning his head on her shoulder. She could feel the weight of his head through her robe. Finally, Draco lifted his head, releasing her from his arms and straightening on the stool. All right, Hermione, he said, his eyes brighter. I'm not locked up yet, and I don't intend to be. It's just— He shook his head. I feel like my future is like the edge of that sylvan ice. It could go either way, success or failure, freedom or Azkaban. There wasn't much to say to that, so she tugged at his hand until he stood up. Come on, she said. You're taking me to lunch. Did you bring a cloak? They had agreed that hooded cloaks were best when going to Nocturnally after lunch, and Malfoy produced a black cloak that Hermione immediately rolled up. Careful there, he objected. That cloak's expensive. His voice trailed off as she easily slid the rolled cloak into a little beaded bag. Cork this pair of ice, please, and hand them to me, Dred, she said, looking inside the bag. I never took out Luna's fishing poles. What are you going to do with these? He asked, handing her the vials. I don't know, but I'm not leaving them around for any random person to find. They shut their robes, and Draco watched interestedly as Hermione locked the potion step door and cast a string of complicated wards. Then Hermione spent some time silently demonstrating her continued confidence in Draco's character on one of the potions tables. I have to admit, I'm not used to this, Malfoy said, looking down at her. He ran his lips along her collarbone, then drifted lower. Hermione's shirt was now unbuttoned, and her bra had vanished entirely. From what I understand, you're quite used to this, she said breathily. Slytherin bad boy, right? Oozing trouble and sex? Not this kind of trouble, he said against her skin. Not this kind of sex. She shivered at the feel of his tongue. You're so sweet, the way you look at me, with wonder, but you're the wonder. His words trailed off into incoherent murmurs as he worked his way down her torso. Hermione, he breathed, and she felt a hand under her skirt tugging at her knickers. Let me— Let's look in here, cried a voice. Not again, Draco groaned, looking up. Let me guess, there's a pygmy puff on my head. Hermione giggled. She couldn't help it. Mr. Malfoy? Piped another voice, sounding like Percival. Draco groaned again and stood, brushing a hand over his hair and jumper to achieve perfection. Hermione, on the other hand, struggled to button her blouse and find her shoes. Alohomora, said a girl's voice, and Hermione nearly fell off the table at the sound of an opening door lock. That Lila is entirely too smart, Hermione muttered, hopping off the table and wiggling uncomfortably. Her knickers were now, well, wedged. Draco grinned at her mockingly.
"Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger!"
The entire Squeaky Mice contingent was in the hallway.
"They're in the potions dungeon. What are they doing in there? Did she hex them again?" "I think he hexed her. She's a mess."
Malfoy was outright laughing now, and Hermione's glare only made him laugh harder. "What are you all doing here?" she asked, hands on her hips. The Squeaky Mice hung their heads.
"We have detention,"
Bertie said.
"Again? It wasn't our fault," Imogen said. "We didn't know it would follow him around."
"Who?"
"Professor Slughorn," Percival said. "He keeps making us fetch his silver flask for him, so I asked Lila to cast a tethering spell." "I thought the flask would stay in his leather satchel," Lila said, looking a little abashed. "But I made the spell a little too strong." "It kept following him around," Imogen said, "floating behind his head and nudging him." "It was a very needy flask," Percival said. "Worse than a pygmy puff." "Hey!" Bertie said. "Cupcake can hear you." "Professor Slughorn couldn't get away from it," Lila said, "and if he ignored it too long, it would pour its drink on his head." "It was a really strong spell," Percival said admiringly. "It was a really strong drink, too." Lila waved her hand in front of her nose. Draco was still laughing and therefore useless, so it was up to Hermione to shoo them all out of the dungeon to wait in the corridor for Slughorn. She couldn't be angry with them, though. Slughorn had deserved what he got. The Squeaky Mice antics had also returned Draco to his earlier light-hearted mood, although he looked a bit sour when she opened the secret passageway from the castle to the Honeyduke's cellar. "You three had all kinds of secrets, don't you?" he asked. "You have no idea," Hermione said with a smile. It was Draco who chose their lunch spot in Diagon Alley, turning up his nose at many nice cafes and pubs. Instead, he led her to a top floor of a tall, impossibly thin building, up a spiral staircase to a landing. Hermione saw no exit, just arched paintings of Parisian scenes. Undeterred, Draco went up to the closest picture, that of an outdoor cafe by the Eiffel Tower, and spoke to the fat waiter in a white apron. "Martins, monsieur, s'il vous plaît," he said. "Oh, très bien, monsieur, mademoiselle." The painted waiter tucked a tray on his arm and bowed. "Ouvrir?" A hole in the ceiling appeared and spread, and the spiral staircase extended higher, curving like a corkscrew through the opening. "After you," Draco said. Hermione climbed the stairs and emerged on the building's top floor, which only had room for 5 tables surrounding by glass walls. She stepped to the nearest window, amazed. She could see all of Diagon Alley, the columns of Gringotts Bank and the dark slash that was likely Nocturne Alley. Muggle London loomed in the background, hazy and grey. A man in black led them to the table. The only other patrons were 2 white-haired wizards with long beards murmuring in Danish? Norwegian? Hermione couldn't tell. The table barely had room for 2 folded napkins and a low pot of roses. Malfoy smoothly slid into his chair as the waiter seated Hermione. "There is no ordering here," Draco told her. "They just bring you food and wine and expect you to love it." Hermione nodded as a server placed wine and a bread before them. "I've never heard of this place. How do you know about it?" she asked. "My mother. She hasn't been here in years. Fell out with Martine one day when she didn't like her table, but Mother brought me here once before I came to Hogwarts. It's very discreet. There's a ward of confidentiality on the dining room." She touched her wand in her skirt pocket, trying to sense the ward. "That's very difficult magic." Confidentiality wards prevented anyone leaving the protected area from discussing anything they'd seen or heard there. "A Gringotts goblin did it for Martine, according to Mother," Draco said, buttering a roll. "So anything we discuss here is strictly confidential. For example," he gave her a wicked smile, "I can tell you that Slytherin House has a charmed quill that writes the correct answers to any test. Any Slytherin can reserve it 3 times a year. I used it for my last Muggle Studies exam." "That's cheating!" Hermione cried, aghast. "Wait, you take Muggle Studies?" "Part of my probation," Draco said. "Deadly dull. Yesterday we learned about toasters and deep fat fryers." He shuddered. "Sounds horrid." "I can't believe no one knows about this quill. It should be confiscated. I should—" "You can't," Draco smiled mockingly.
By the way, I told Brown yesterday that Theo is in love with her."
"Draco!"
Hermione cried.
"You didn't!"
He winked at her. "Better him than me. And now you can't tell Theo." Hermione groaned. "I hate this place already. You're going to sit here and tell me all the nefarious things you've been up to this year, aren't you? And I thought we'd have a nice lunch." Draco reached out and took her hand. "It is a nice lunch," he said. "I'll tell you what else is nice. How my family's French house elf brings tea and fresh pastries to my bedroom every morning." His smile widened. "If you're there, you can have some as well." I don't believe you." Hermione pulled her hand back. "How could you?" "Her name is Aimée," Draco went on. "Quite useful, really. Healed me of that stinging hex Theo gave me like that." He snapped his fingers. "You had a house elf heal you that night?" "Of course." Draco looked smug. "What would you have me do? Suffer?" "Yes, I mean no, I thought—" Her throat was suddenly tight. Draco took her hand again. "Oh, you were worried, weren't you?" His eyes glittered. "You wanted to sneak down to my room and heal me, didn't you?" He kissed her hand. "I wish you had." He murmured, his lips on her wrists. "It would have moved things along." Hermione blushed furiously and pulled her hand away as the waiter set down 2 plates of snails. "Bon appétit!" She turned her attention to her plate just to look at something else. She'd eaten snails before, but had a little trouble with the tongs, while Draco gracefully ate all of his and the rest of hers, while she struggled with the first shell. Then he poured another glass of wine, while Hermione dipped the first tiny shred of snail she'd excavated into butter sauce. "You know," he said with hooded eyes, "feeding your dining partner is considered very romantic. We may have to consider it if it's the only way you'll be able to eat today." "I don't know why the French even eat snails." "Escargot." "They might as well serve slugs, put them in little petals or butter rolls." "What?" "They're the same thing after all," Hermione went on, waving her tiny snail fork. "What are slugs in French?" "Limaces," he said with a frown. "See? Limaces and lettuce wraps. Sounds lovely, and no tongues." "It is of infinite comfort to me," Draco pronounced, "that our lunch setting prevents you from raising this appalling topic with anyone else, although that doesn't help my present situation." Hermione just smiled as the waiter whisked away the plates and brought lobster bisque. "I know," Draco said. "Why don't you tell me something not Limace related? Confidentiality guaranteed." She thought for a moment. "Ginny thinks Blaise is too perfect," she said. Draco shrugged. "Blaise has always been perfect, even as a child. His mother made sure of it. If Louisette is hoping he'll open his heart to her, she'll be waiting for a long time." "She'll probably break up with him then," Hermione said sadly. "I don't know. Most women are incurably optimistic," he said, pointing his spoon at her. "Case in point." Hermione was happy to see the main course arrive. Duck lettuce wraps with anchovy cream sauce. Finally, something solid to eat. "On Wednesday, I saw a Slytherin boy add emeralds to the House Point hourglass," she said brightly. "I've been watching for signs of tampering, and apparently it's a regular thing, so I've enchanted the hourglass. Now every time a Slytherin tries to add emeralds, twice as many will be lost the next day." Draco nearly dropped his fork. "You can't do that. Pansy was going to add another 10 points today." "Then 20 will be lost tomorrow." She leaned forward. "And nobody will know why." Draco looked horrified. "You're right," Hermione said. "This is a very nice lunch." His eyes narrowed. "I honestly thought that regular snugging would make you less insufferable." "Now who's being incurably optimistic?" she asked. They had no time to finish their dessert, since Vasile awaited them in Nocturnelli, so they left Martine's with box eclairs in Hermione's beaded bag. They hadn't walked a block, however, before stopping to open a box on a park bench behind a mass of moonflower vines. "We'll have to hurry," Hermione said, taking a large bite of eclair. "Yes, it simply wouldn't do to keep a vampire waiting," Draco said. "It's not safe for him to just hang around," she said. Draco snickered. "You mean upside down?" "Not funny." He leaned forward. "Hold still, you have chocolate on your face." She held still, and he kissed the side of her mouth, licking the bottom lip. "Delicious." "We shouldn't. Not here," she began. "Hold still, there's more," he said, and kissed her again. "Hello, dear," said a soft voice. Draco and Hermione broke apart instantly and jumped to their feet. Standing before them was Narcissa Malfoy. Hermione couldn't speak. Did the woman have Hermione alert wards set up around Diagon Alley? And did Hermione still have chocolate on her face? She looked over at Draco and saw that her boyfriend, she supposed he was a boyfriend, Merlin help her, was flinging his limbs about in an odd little dance. At first Hermione thought Narcissa had actually hexed him, but then she realized that Draco had moved to kiss his mother, then thought better of it, decided to shake hands, changed his mind again, and finished with a bow, all practically at the same time. Hermione and Narcissa watched his antics for a time, but the fun was over all too soon. "Miss Granger," Narcissa purred, "so nice to see you. I beg you to excuse my son for a moment while he has a word with his mother." "Of course," Hermione said. "No, mother," said Draco, who had gotten himself under control. "Hermione can stay and hear whatever you need to say." "I would not advise it," Narcissa said. "Neither would I," Hermione put in. "Nonetheless, I insist." Draco's voice was silky now, pure Lucius. "Fine," Hermione said, glancing at her watch. Narcissa moved to sit on the bench, which placed Hermione and Draco standing before her like misbehaving children. "Draco," Narcissa said, her voice icy, "your father was very disappointed by the lack of respect in your response to his letter." "And I was disappointed by the lack of respect in his letter," Draco said. "Also, to my understanding, he is no longer my father since, as you can see," he waved a hand at Hermione's cars, "I have not acceded to his request." Hermione didn't miss the formality of Draco's last sentence, and by Narcissa's look she was going to answer her son in high chant. "He will always be your father, Draco," she said, "and he would be very displeased to see a Malfoy engage in such unseemly behavior as I have seen here." "Well, unless I take Hermione into Azkaban and snuck her there, he won't have to worry about it," Draco said. "Draco, you're being rude in front of your friend," Narcissa said blandly. "Nevertheless, your actions do not credit to your family or to your betrothed." Draco gritted his teeth. "Mother, Astoria is not my betrothed. I have every right to see Hermione." Hermione sighed. As riveting as Draco's family drama was, she couldn't stay any longer. "Lady Malfoy," she said, "I hope you will excuse me, but I'm late for an appointment." "That's right," Draco said. "Mother, you'll have to excuse both of us." "I can go on my own," Hermione said. Draco turned on her. "You are not meeting that appointment alone. You promised." "It's perfectly safe." "I am sure that Miss Granger is quite capable on her own," Narcissa said. Draco ignored this. "Hermione, you are not going anywhere near that appointment without me." "It's a very nice appointment and will be no trouble, and I'm leaving now, so you can either accompany me or not," Hermione said. "Surely, Draco, you can spare a little more time for your loving Narcissa began. "No, I cannot," Draco said, grabbing Hermione's hand to keep her from leaving. "Hermione and I have serious business that cannot wait." He stepped closer to Narcissa. "I know you don't understand what I'm doing, Mother. I know you don't like it. You listened to Lucius during the war. I'm asking you to listen to me now. I certainly can't do worse. Now I have to go with Hermione, and I will try to visit soon." "Your father is very angry, Draco," Narcissa said. "I know, and I'm sorry for your sake." He bent down and kissed Narcissa on the cheek, then stalked off, pulling Hermione along with him. To be continued. Next up, Draco gets handsy in Nocturne Alley. Thank you for listening to this chapter of the Gloriana set by ThebeMoon. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on Spotify, YouTube, or AO3.